Welcome to this series of videos looking at the landscape. The landscape has been a source of inspiration and material for generations and generations of artists. It has developed from the time of the Renaissance as purely being a decorative aspect to the background of figure painting and genre painting, to its high point during the 19th century, where it was then regarded as a art form in its own right, as demonstrated by artists like Turner and Constable. This series of videos won't specifically look at too much just drawing or just painting, but looking at those aspects that we need to be thinking about when we're dealing with the subject matter of the landscape. So you will at times see me drawing and setting exercises where you need to be using pencils, and other times exercises that you can be responding with coloured media, oil paints, watercolours, even coloured pencils or pastels. As is often the best place to start, let's look at some of the underlying structures that you need to understand to work with the landscape as a subject matter. When we look at a picture like this one by Arthur Streeton, we have to recognise that there are distinct parts that are the underlying structure that make up the landscape and give that landscape a sense of space. When I say space, I'm not just talking about that sense of depth. Space is also that sense of the viewer, as in you, as not just looking at a landscape, but inhabiting that landscape. So there's 5 distinct areas that we're looking at when we look at any landscape. You have the foreground, which in the case of this Streeton is that area. I'll just draw basic rectangle so that we can start to define that. When we're talking about the foreground, we're talking about that area here. So this area here. The next main area that we're dealing with is the middle ground. So in the case of this landscape by Streeton again, it's that area between the foreground and there to the horizon line. So this space in here. The middle ground. Right, foreground. Then the next space is this area here, which is the background. Now, in this case, it's these distant hills that we can see. We then have the sky. And last but not least is any landscape of any sort will have a main motif. And in the case of this Streeton, I would talk about the tree here as being the main motif. Now there are some elements, and this Streeton displays those very well, that we should think about when we're looking at each of these parts. And this relates to then how beginning of that feeling of distance starts to occur. From the horizon line, anything above the horizon line, so in this case the background and the sky, are connected tonally. And anything from the horizon line below, so in this case the middle ground and the foreground and into the main motive, they are connected tonally. So you have that clear distinction between the upper part and the lower part in the case of this landscape. You then, if we move here into the foreground, is that the foreground is usually a very narrow range of tones. So it's not wide, in range of tones, but it is also the most detailed. Now, when I say detailed, it's not necessarily just objects or individual things. When I say most detailed, it can be that there's a density of brush marks. There can be the size of those brush marks, the direction. It can also sometimes be where you'll find figures and things like that. So in the case of the Streeton here, we can find that these figures are attached to this area of the foreground. The foreground was also, if you think about in previous classes, we have spoken about those compositional shapes, things like triangles, the L shape, the steelyard, etc., etc., the diagonal. It's often here that this foreground shape creates one of those compositional shapes. And in the case of, again, this here by Arthur Streeton, is that I would talk about it that it's an L shape that this compositional device is that's being used. We then work here into the middle ground. Now the middle ground is where you will find the widest range of tones. But it will be less detailed. So again here, if we look at this Streeton, it's where we're finding that he's got the darkest darks, not quite the lightest lights, but there is a contrast between those two areas, and it's a fairly big contrast. The other thing that you'll notice that as it's moved from this foreground area now into this next area here in the middle ground, is that it has also started to become bluer too. It takes on a bluey tinge. And in the case of these colours that we're seeing here in the foreground being repeated, they've also started to go bluer and in some cases more violet too. We then move here into the background, this area through here. There will be little or no tonal variation, and as I said before, will relate in tone to the sky, so that we'll find that this edge here between the background and the sky will often either be only half found or lost as an edge. So if you squint down, it becomes hard to discern that edge where those mountains are, compared to that edge there of the horizon. Our last aspect is here the main motive, which is again the tree. Here you will find probably the greatest contrasts of tone. And if we look at it, we've got here on the trunks and things like that, it's where the darkest shadows and the lightest lights in terms of a distance between these two tones. It's a greater distance than what's between the two tones in this area. If we look at these areas through here, it's where there is detail. So if you again look at the size of the brush marks and what's going on in this area here, Streeton is making lots of little marks with his brush. It will also be placed in consideration of the golden section too, quite often. So if we again look at this painting by Streeton, it's if we divide again the width of our picture here into 8 equal parts and decide roughly where 5 and 3 meet, we're looking here at about the meeting of 3 parts and 5 parts. So that tells us that that tree's pretty much sitting on the golden section that way. Interestingly too, if we divide the painting loosely into 3 and 5 this way as well, that the base of the tree is roughly on the 3 and 5 too. So there's a lot of interesting key things happening up through here. For your first exercise, I want you to choose a print or find a reproduction in a book or from the internet of a landscape. Look for artists like the Australian Impressionists, Streeton, Roberts, maybe Corot or Constable, or even Hans Huyssen. I want you to mass the 5 major parts like we've discussed in their generalised tone. This generalised tone is usually the mid-tone of that mass. I want you to also take notes describing what the artist has done in each part. For example, how have they created detail in the foreground? Where have they placed the main motif, etc. And do this exercise more than once. Do it from a Constable, a Corot, and a Streeton, for instance. The next exercise is for those of you that might feel comfortable using a bit of colour or willing to just give it a go. Using the previous exercise, the mass drawing, pencil out the major shapes. Then mass out in colour the dominant or generalised colour of each part, making sure it also matches in tone to your drawing. The finished painting will be done in flat masses of colour and tone. As always, good luck with this week's exercise, and I look forward to seeing you in Zoom.